How do you now look back at your playoff journey?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question because we started at the beginning from last year and how did we get to the end? And I think some really important, impactful things happened to our team in the December, January of last year. It's kind of like winning streaks. You can feel a streak coming while you're losing games, and then your game's getting better and off you took off, and then you can feel a losing streak coming because at the end of your winning streak, you're not playing the same way. So we started playing very well in December, January, but you couldn't tell. And part of that was schedule based. A big chunk of that was injury based. But the forming of the team that we would become happened way sooner than probably people that maybe Panther fans, people that didn't follow our team would have seen, geez, they got hot at the playoffs. They just barely made it in. But we had been in trouble in November, December of last year and dug a big hole, but the quality of our game really started to turn then. And we were a pretty darn good team from January 1st on. So we have some faith in that. But then you hit the playoffs and have a run like we did. And I think it's framed all in the first series and that you beat a team like Boston at 135 points. So that the idea is you punched above your weight class, and we did. And that would have been true for almost every team in the league going up against Boston and coming back in the fashion that we did. Toronto is such a different animal because of the scrutiny on the series. But the Toronto-Carolina was also almost the peak of the quality of our play, and then also the start of our demise. We got ourselves to Vegas, and Vegas was just better than we were. Tactically as well, they played a better game than we played and a more consistent game than we played, but we truly did get to a point that the quality of our play started to suffer. It wasn't a matter of will or compete or hardness or even tactics at that point. We had spent everything that we had to spend to get to where we got to and had nothing left.
Do you ever think back to Game 5 in the Boston series, and I'm sure it was in slow motion for you, but Brad Marchand skating down the ice on a breakaway with less than 2 seconds to go and shooting the puck with less than a second to go, and that would have ended the series.
Right. So that is the most poignant one for sure. And in truth, my heart didn't go up into my throat until Aaron Ekblad went down to sweep the puck. And that's when I thought, oh my God, he's going to sweep it into the net. He went down on one leg to clear the puck out of the way. And that's when it went, oh my God. But boy, that event happened a whole bunch of times between Game 5 and Game 7. We got behind us in Game 6. We had leads, lost leads. I mean, we scored with the goaltender out to tie the game to get it to overtime in Game 7. So we had a whole bunch of those, and there's that idea, you got to be lucky to have success, and there are just so many points. And I would say in some ways the same was true in Vegas at times, but not quite as often. There's 50 inflection points in a playoff run to the Stanley Cup final where it's over even if something normal happens. Marchand's going to score that goal. What the average breakaway scores 33% of the time. So 1 in 3 it goes in. You would think when you stack up that 1 in 3 event 20 times, it's gonna go against you, but it didn't, right? I mean, that happened a whole bunch of times, even in the Toronto series, certainly in the Carolina series, especially in the game when Barkov didn't play. They were on us and they had lots of great chances. So goaltending is the great equalizer and the great hider and the great augmenter of a season. And Sergei Bobrovsky came in, and then Alex Lyons certainly at the start to get us the first win against Boston to still the belief that we could. But Sergei Bobrovsky's play was the driving force in a lot of ways.
A personal note, I love hanging out and getting a chance to catch up with you, but I didn't feel right doing it during the Stanley Cup final because I was wearing one pin, you were wearing another pin, and it just felt awkward to me. But I sat in on all of your availabilities, and it was awesome. So cool, especially about your son. How much of the chapter in your book would last year take up?
It was just such a special kind of faith builder in some ways for me, for the enjoyment of the game, to find it again. And then I don't think I've ever articulated this well, and I don't think I can do it now, to almost be a spectator / observer in what was going on around this team in the last 4 or 5 months. That idea that a group of men could treat each other the way these guys did, to work as hard, to overcome all the adversity. Sometimes those are just casual words that we fire out at adversity. I mean, really, how much adversity is in pro sports? Like, we all get to go home and things are pretty good. So I want to be mindful of that. But I got to watch it from the outside, not necessarily as a driver of it, but certainly as somebody that fed off it, and the way as much fun as they had. You always, at the start of every year, we're all talking about identity, right? Especially if there's a new regime that's come in, they're talking about identity, and then the idea, then the camera's on the coach a lot to drive that identity. And I think that that's important, especially early on. But the identity of the team here was very quickly taken over by the players and built by the players, and what they valued, they were able to continue and build on. And it was right, like the culture that they created, that made it different than any other year possible. And that's not I've enjoyed other years in hockey for sure. I've been really fortunate that I've worked with good men, good ownership, good management my entire career. And then to come here and realize, we're kind of secondary. It's the players. It's about the players and what they build themselves. So I got to watch that. And because it was so different from my normal experiences in the NHL, I would say it's a good half of the book right now. And that's kind of the excitement, but also if there's tension in my world right now, it's how do we create that again? What are the small pieces the coaching staff had in creating that and making sure that we give those players that opportunity to create it again?
Would the Paul Maurice that broke into the league believe that coaches didn't have that as much influence as you now acknowledge?
Well, you know what? Some of it is we're conditioned by the fact that we get fired all the time to believe that we are that responsible for all things that happen. Certainly responsible for something bad that happens. And what's that line? Coaches lose, players win. There's some truth to that. But silly words, organic growth of something that happened that you really didn't like. You'd like to think you set in motion because you were consistent with your theme and your identity and how you wanted to play. We were very consistent with the staff. We needed to change the way we played the game, and we needed to kind of get really consistent with that. And it had to be born through hard things to really convince them. Well, also a lot of players didn't have a lot of playoff experience here. They hadn't gone really on a long run, and they were you come off a 122-point season, you're thinking, well, they're right there. But there was a whole lot they had to go through. But their willingness to go through it and to stay in it is a credit to leadership and character in the room. It truly is. There's a great story there. And maybe if I would have taken this experience back to my first year, I wouldn't have taken things so personally, because it's actually not all on the coach. The players have a far bigger impact on all things that happen, and whether you changed a line in the third period or not really doesn't make that much of a difference. They either believe it or they didn't, and then hopefully some good things happen.
Was too much made out of that watershed moment in Toronto behind the bench and you giving them shit?
Probably. It was more truly cathartic for me. I mean, it was solid, but it was more just exasperation and angst born out of faith that I had in them, that they could do it. We had played, it's so hard to explain to people. We got beat in Ottawa 2 days earlier, but I loved our game. We played hard, we played right. It was a special teams loss in a lot of ways, but the quality of our game was good. So you come into the game off a loss in Ottawa, feeling good about where you're at, like thinking, okay, this is the start of that idea, that streak. And then we got offered a buffet of desserts, and we just dove right into it. This is going to be a turnover festival, and which was the exact opposite to play a team like Toronto. You just can't get in that transition game with them. And we had turned a puck over right at the offensive blue line again. Really good player did it, by the way. And they went down, scored on an offside goal. So we knew it was offside by the time the puck had hit the back of the net. So we challenged, and that gave the kind of timeout opportunity. And that was just a whole lot of frustration built up, and I let it fly. And I don't know. Sometimes they hear you. But at the very least, I would say this. The idea would be that the players took over the team at that point. You're going to keep turning the puck over, you can, but we're not winning. So you need to get this right. And there's nothing more we can do to convince you.
My memory of that moment wasn't necessarily you, but it was the fact that Matthew Tkachuk turned around and was watching you. Lots of players look straight ahead. Lots of players keep looking at the ice surface as the coach rants on, but he turned his head. And that told me that maybe more than some players, he was listening.
So Matthew's an interesting guy. He's a hyper competitive guy. And I think probably having worked with Daryl for a couple of years, he was waiting for that speech 2 months earlier. He was probably waiting for it. And I think he was probably just measuring the words to see if it was if I was delivering something that he'd like to do. And now in fairness, then Matthew also being the very creative player that he is, he has to have room to turn some pucks over. Like he has to. Right. It's just that his completion rate is higher than most other players, but those guys have to have room to try some plays that don't go. And I wasn't trying to limit that, but you're always on that. When you have a skilled team, you're always kind of trying to figure out where that line is where will you hold them accountable to the turnover. We had a great clip earlier in the year of actually Nick Cousins running the exact same play twice. And the first clip I showed, it was a turnover, and it was an egregious turnover. And we all nodded at his head. And I said, but the problem with that, me showing him that, was the very next clip was he did the exact same thing, put it inside, and it was in the back of the net. So where is that line drawn? So we tried to explain that really wasn't about the decision that Nick Cousins made. It was about the speed and the other thing that was going around. You don't get to make that play in certain situations, but you absolutely have the green light to. So when you come into the team with 122 points, right, you're giving them an awful lot of room to make plays. Why wouldn't you? They've made these plays, and that's who they think they are. So you don't come in with the idea you got to dump every puck. We just got to get this thing right. So it took us months, I think, to get to the point that we understood there's and what they didn't know at the time is when you get to the playoffs, that situation, that Nick Cousins situation where one decision right is one decision is wrong, not based on anything else but where everybody else is. When you hit that offensive line in the playoffs, they're going to have 3 or 4 or 5 guys back. It's not true in the regular season, but they are. So we've got to get that mindset right. That's why coaches, I think in general, will come in and say, let's make the smart play. Let's get it deep, dump the puck. You don't want to dump the puck every time. That doesn't make any sense, but you got to get it right. And that was after 5 months of even myself battling whether I'm screaming at them or not for a turnover. They had just hit the threshold with me mentally. I'm not sure what I said, but clearly I had